Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here. This is an Andariel's Visage based Chain Lightning build designed to speed farm tier 100 to 110 pits and turn our overhealing into mana thanks to the Starlight aspect. I've done up to tier 120 pits with this build without having fully optimized my gear, and it can also handle tier 8 hordes as well with just this single mythic. Make sure you check out the build planner in the description below, as it will have the non-mythic variant of this build as well. It's a lot of fun to play, so I hope you enjoy it if you try it out for yourself. Before we get into it, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you like this kind of content. It helps out the channel a lot, and I super appreciate it. Leave a comment if you want to as well. Thanks everyone, now let's get to the build. So for the skill tree, we're going to start with 2 ranks into Firebolt. We're going to come down to our core skills, and we're going to take 1 into Charged Bolt, going for Destructive Charged Bolts. Then we're going to go for Devastation, with 3 into Elemental Dominance. And of course, we're going to go for Chain Lightning, 5 points, and we're going to go for Greater Chain Lightning. Next up, for the defensive skills, we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, 1 into Teleport, and we're going to go for Shimmering Teleport, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 3 into Ice Armor, and go for Mystical Ice Armor. Then down in our Conjuration skills, we're taking 1 into Ice Blades, going for the Summoned Ice Blades, Lightning Spear, going for the Invoked Lightning Spear, 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 1 into Align the Elements, to get the 3 in Mana Shield, and 3 in Protection. Going down to our Mastery skills, we're taking 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. Then we're going to go for 2 into Static Discharge. Then in our ultimate skills, we're taking 1 into Coursing Currents to get 3 in Electrocution. And then we're taking 1 into Unstable Currents with Prime Unstable Currents. And for our key passives, we're going to take Veer's Mastery. A quick note for these skills: if you're doing lower tier pits, like say tier 100, then you don't actually need to use Flame Shield, or you don't need the extra points into Ice Armor, so you could remove these and put them into something like Precision Magic. And instead of Flame Shield, you would use Lightning Spear. Now we have the enchantments. We're going to go for Ice Blades in the first slot, so every 40 seconds in cooldowns we spend, we spawn an Ice Blades on a random enemy. And for our second slot, we're using Firebolt, so direct damage from skills applies burning damage over 8 seconds. Next up, we have the Paragon Board. In the starting board, I'm going to go for the Unleash glyph, so after spending 50 mana, we deal 8% increased damage, and gain 25% increased mana regen for 3 seconds. So that's our first board. For the second board, we're going for the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Elementalist glyph here, so dealing fire, cold, or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, and that will stack once per element. For our third board, we're going for Burning Instinct, and then we're going to use the Tactician glyph, so we deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill, increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on the bar. For our fourth board, we're going for Ceaseless Conduit, and we're going to put in the Destruction glyph to give us all that critical strike damage, as well as critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 12%. For our fifth board, we're going for Frigid Fate, taking the legendary node, so we deal bonus damage to vulnerable equal to 20% of the total amount of our bonus damage with cold, up to 60%. And we're going to put in the Charge glyph here for the Crackling Energy damage, but more importantly, picking up the Crackling Energy grants us 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, stacking up to 15%. For our sixth board, we're going up from there, and we're going to get the Searing Heat board. And we're going to use the Exploit glyph here, that gives us vulnerable damage, as well as dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds up to 10%. For our 7th board, we're going to go for the Static Surge board, and we're going to put in the Flame Feeder glyph, so we get damage to burning enemies, and we deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. And for our 8th board, we're going to go with the Elemental Summoner board, so our Conjuration skills have 10% reduced cooldown or mana cost, and they also deal bonus damage equal to 10% of the total amount of our bonus damage with Fire, Lightning and Cold, up to 60%. For the glyph, we're going to use the Control glyph here, so that gives us damage to crowd controlled enemies, and we also deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen. So that pretty much wraps up the Paragon board. All of this will be in the build planner in the description below, and make sure you check out the notes there as well, as I'll update any changes in there. Next up we have the gear. So on the left I'll list the affixes you want and the tempering as well. So let's start with the Helm. We're going to go for Endara's Visage of course. That's going to give us all stats, life on hit and attack speed, and some max poison resist. As for the unique aspect, we have up to a 20% chance on lucky hit to trigger a Poison Nova that applies poison damage over 5 seconds to enemies in the area. This is going to be useful to proc our 4th element on the Talrash's ring, and Endara's is going to be our only source of life on hit, and a huge source of attack speed. We're going to need that life on hit to regenerate our mana, as I'll touch on later when I get to the aspect. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the life on hit once, and the attack speed twice. Next up we have the chest piece. We're just going for a normal chest piece with intelligence, max life and armor. As for the tempering, we're going to temper that with lucky hit percent chance to stun, and ranks into warmth. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of the Orange Herald, so on lucky hit, up to a 5 to 10% chance to reduce the cooldown of our ultimate skill by 2 seconds, and this can only happen once per skill cast. This is what we're going to use to basically keep our unstable currents on permanently. And as for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the intelligence. Next up we have the gloves. We're going to go for some gloves with crit chance, attack speed, and chain lightning, and we're going to temper that with lucky hit percent chance to freeze, and critical strike damage. For the aspect, we're going to go with the lightning rod aspect, so chain lightning has a 25% chance to deal 50 to 80% increased damage, and that's doubled against bosses or CC'd enemies. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the chain lightning here. Next up we have the pants. We're going to go for the axial conduit. That's going to give us chance for chain lightning projectiles to cast twice, damage reduction, resource generation and maximum, and ranks into chain lightning. As for the unique aspect, chain lightning will alternate between orbiting us and seeking up to 3 enemies. When it returns, it drains 6 mana from us for each active chain lightning. After draining 66 total mana, the bolt will explode for lightning damage, and chain lightning will expire if we don't have enough mana for it to drain. As for the masterworking, although they are all good affixes, we're going to try and masterwork the damage reduction here, as we're really lacking that thanks to having no defensive aspects on our armor or no Shaco. If you don't have access to axial conduit, then you would use normal pants with max life, intelligence, and armor. You would temper that with warmth and lucky hit percent chance to freeze. As for the masterworking, you would masterwork the intelligence. And for the aspect, you would use something like concentration, so casting a conjuration skill also grants you 15 to 25% damage reduction for 5 seconds. Alternatively, you could use something like Everliving, so you take 10 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies, or Snow Veiled, so casting Ice Armor will make you unstoppable and grant 25% damage reduction for 3.5 to 5 seconds. Or Mage Lords isn't bad either. Next up, we have the boots. We're going to go for Esu's Heirloom here. That gives us movement speed after killing an elite, critical strike damage, and resist all. Also, the unique aspect gives us critical strike chance, increased by 20 to 40% of our movement speed bonus. This is going to be a huge source of critical strike chance, especially after we evade, and with some greater affixes on crit, this is how you would get to 100% critical strike chance. And for the masterworking, we're going to masterwork the critical strike damage. If you don't have access to Esu's Heirloom, you could use some normal boots with intelligence, move speed, and max life, and you would temper that with move speed and crowd control duration. As for the aspect, you would move aspect of the Orange Herald to the boots, and you would use one of the previously mentioned defensive aspects on your chest piece. Next up we have the main hand. We're going to be using a 1 tier, and we're going to look for something with intelligence, crit damage, and maximum life or life on hit. I prefer the maximum life with this version of the build, as Andariel's gives us a huge amount of life on hit already. So we're going to temper that with chance for Chain Lightning to cast twice and critical strike damage, and we're going to try and masterwork the chance for Chain Lightning projectiles to cast twice. As for the aspect, we're going to go with the aspect of Shredding Blades here, so Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerables increased by 20%, and the duration is increased by 4 seconds, and you also gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage. For the offhand, we're going to go with an offhand with intelligence, critical strike chance, and cooldown reduction, and we're going to temper that with chance for Chain Lightning to cast twice and critical strike damage. We're going to try and masterwork the chance for Chain Lightning to cast twice, and we're going to put on the conceded aspect here, so we deal 10 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. Next up for the Amulet, we're going to be using an Amulet with cooldown reduction, Devouring Blaze, and Conjuration Mastery if possible. If you can't get those, then critical strike chance and glass cannon are good as well. As for the tempering, we're going to temper that with Unstable Currents cooldown reduction and critical strike damage. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the ranks into Devouring Blaze. For the aspect, we're going to be using the Stormswell aspect here, so we deal 23 to 45% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next up we have the rings. For our first ring, we're going to be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That gives us lucky hit chance, non-physical damage, cooldown reduction, and ranks into potent warding. But also for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 80%, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. So with this build we're going to have all 4 stacks of that, thanks to Andariel's Visage and our built-in fire, cold, and lightning damage. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction here. For our second ring, we're going to be using a normal ring with intelligence, attack speed, and critical strike chance. We're going to temper that with resource cost reduction and critical strike damage. Alternatively, instead of resource cost reduction, you could go for Unstable Currents cooldown reduction. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork either the critical strike chance or the attack speed, depending on what you're lacking and what greater affix you have. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the Starlight aspect, so we gain 25 to 40 of our primary resource for every 20% of our life that we heal. And this is going to be how we maintain our mana, the Starlight aspect in conjunction with the Andariel's Visage. As each time we hit anything, we're going to get 742, in my case, life back, and 20% of my health would be around 3100-ish. So each time we heal that amount, I will get 40 mana. Obviously with the huge amount of targets Chain Lightning and our other abilities will hit, we're going to gain a crap load of mana from this aspect, and it will be enough to sustain us. So if you don't happen to have access to Talrash's, you would use a duplicate of the secondary ring here, and for the aspect you would want to use Accelerating. So critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 10 to 25% for 5 seconds. That pretty much wraps up the gear. For the gems, I'm using 3 skulls in the jewellery, but if you are lacking some ore resist, then you would change one of them to a diamond. For the weapon and offhand, I'm using the emeralds for the critical strike damage, and for the armour, I'm using a mix of topazes for the intelligence and rubies for the max life. But you could easily go with all 5 being topazes here, no problem. I just took some of the rubies because I was trying to push the pits earlier. So that pretty much wraps up the build. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video or made it this far, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and leave a comment in the comment section below, as it all really helps out a lot, helps the channel grow, and I would really appreciate it. And just a quick reminder again, don't forget to check the build planner for the non-Andariel's version of the build, where there won't be any mythic items required. So thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!